The new order will come with safeguards. Creating a new legal framework for peace in Europe is no trivial task. Trust in matters of European security must be based on the physical impossibility for the West to breach agreements. It is commonly believed that the international order is not the result of specific agreements but a product of a shared understanding of what is permissible in relations between states. There is also a prevalent opinion that all significant powers should have a relatively common understanding of why they recognize each other's right to exist and refrain from interfering in each other's internal affairs. This idea was extensively discussed by the late Henry Kissinger, whose ideas were considered a benchmark of geostrategic thinking not only in the West but also in Russia. However, the upcoming times will likely require a more creative approach to the established views on how states can guarantee respect for each other's basic interests and values. It is the violation of these interests and values that always causes conflict, as evidenced by the current military-political confrontation in Europe. In his speech at the UN Security Council, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov emphasized that any agreement with the West on European security must include safeguards against unscrupulous interpretations. Although it is currently difficult to envision how such safeguards could be physically implemented, diplomats likely already have ideas on this matter. One can speculate about the nature of such mechanisms. It is clear what negative behaviors of the West they should be aimed against. Primarily, they should address the West's constant attempts to create threats to others as a central part of global diplomacy. Therefore, it is necessary to limit the physical ability to create such threats. Safeguards in this context are technical means to ensure that a state, or bloc, cannot change its behavior to a hostile one or exploit ambiguities for its selfish interests. The premise of cannot is crucial since the premise of does not want to is no longer reliable after NATO's expansion to include Finland. The alliance has trampled all formal and informal principles on which the post-Cold War European security system was attempted to be built. We see that none of the agreements made during that time are working. The US unilaterally withdrew from key treaties that formed the hard framework of European security. NATO's eastward expansion, essentially the expansion of the American military presence in Europe, rendered all agreements on conventional arms meaningless. Thus, devising a new legal framework for peace in Europe is a highly non-trivial task. The renowned skill of Russian diplomacy will be essential. A universal order that satisfies everyone is unlikely at present. It has always been relative. However, in the past century, there was at least a general understanding among leading powers of the principles on which internal order in each state should be based. It is difficult to imagine that Western countries will now agree to recognize Russia, China, or other states' right to determine their own way of life. Firstly, any future security order will inevitably be technical in nature, not based on a common understanding of challenges and threats. This means it will have little room for principles and much room for specific parameters to prevent the West from threatening Russia's core interests. Russia's proposals from late 2021 already contained many features of a functioning European security system. These will likely be revisited once the US is ready for serious negotiations. Much will depend on how soon America understands the impossibility of continuing its irresponsible policies. Currently, concern for the future of their country is being voiced by some American politicians. We will see to what extent their understanding translates into concrete actions. Secondly, it is hard to imagine that future agreements will accommodate the concept of trust. Unfortunately, trust is not available to all political systems without exception. We see Americans openly state that any new administration can easily revise agreements made by the previous one. Policy continuity is disappearing in the West, which has always been the foundation of stable diplomatic relations. Especially since the modern world is extremely diverse. Trust is possible as in Russia-China relations in situations where both parties share a common understanding of major threats. Russia and the West currently lacks such common understanding. Simply because for the US and its satellites, the entire surrounding world represents a threat. As long as Westerners cannot adapt to the new international reality, it will be challenging to take their words seriously. Therefore, Trust in European security matters must be based on the physical impossibility for the West to breach any agreements. And no one in Russia doubts that the West will periodically desire to do so. Thirdly, the legal basis for European security will likely be broader. The situation in Europe has long ceased to be a matter solely for Europeans. Especially as the positions of two powers with the largest nuclear arsenals in the world, Russia and the US, directly intersect here. Their indirect neighborhood concerns the entire world and has little to do with Europe per southeast. It is no coincidence that the most reasonable proposals for ending the armed conflict in Ukraine now come from China, India, Brazil, and even African countries. Europeans, in turn, are unable to offer anything that reflects objective reality. They simply go with the flow. In other words, security in Europe is both a local and global problem. The broad international community must guarantee how the West will adhere to its potential commitments. Finally, the technical aspects themselves could include measures previously uncommon in international practice. For instance, the complete or nearly complete demilitarization of certain territories and entire states. Unfortunately, the practice of the last 30 years has shown that not all states can bear the heavy burden of independently determining their defense policy parameters. The Baltic republics of the former USSR, Finland, or even unfortunate Ukraine could have lived quite happily if their political elites had not been tempted to use conflict with Russia to stay in power despite any economic difficulties. In such a case, they would probably have had to focus more on internal development and integrating into the global economy rather than becoming centers of instability. In other words, countries that cannot play an independent role in defining regional security should be stripped of the physical capability to create problems for it. This approach might gain more traction in the future. Simply because the risk of sovereign states becoming battlegrounds for great powers is too high. The main technical and legal parameters of the European security system are yet to be devised by diplomats and agreed upon by politicians. However, it is already clear from bitter experience that leaving the situation in uncertainty is impossible. It poses too great a threat to global peace and survival.